influence this
We're going to
panel?
start.
Start is reading the line.
I
That's
did
what I
it
said.
twice, but it's right.
Let's be bad.
So this panel, this discussion came about because I don't remember what the context was, but about almost a year ago, or at least 10 months ago, Maria and I started talking about things that we read as kids that were really bad. I mean, bad in the sense that they were like, what were we thinking when we were reading these? And how they influenced us as adults, either as editors, writers, as feminists, women, or whatever. And we said, this is fascinating. And we threw out these, like, well, you'll hear some of them. Some of them are on here already. But, and we said, we should do a panel on this. And initially, we proposed it to World Fantasy, but because it was an all-female panel, I said, forget it. I mean, basically, yes. That's not why they said that, but David used it. So then we thought ICFA, and we're trying to, well, each one we had, well, who do we want on it, and who's going to be at what conventions? And then we tried ICFA, and I forget why you weren't.
I didn't get it.
And since we thought of it together, we had it both be there. And so we didn't do it there. And then we said, what about Readercon? It's perfect, it's small, it's kind of convention that can handle it, no one will get all weird about it.
And it's a literary panel.
Yeah. So
It's a really literary panel.
So we basically
Some evidence to the
proposed
contrary,
it.
notwithstanding.
We proposed it to programming, and we tried to get a mix of women, ages, and all kinds of people. And here we are. So this is what we are. What the panel that does. Do people want to introduce themselves very quickly first?
I'm Kit Reed.
All right. Ellen Datlow.
Herman Hesse.
I'm Kelley Eskridge. I'm Julia Rios.
So we're all either right. I may be the only editor.
No, I'm
Oh,
not
no,
editor.
you edited.
I'm an editor.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're editors and writers, and so
I'm
that's
a
where this
freelancer.
came from. Okay, you take it a little bit.
Okay, so we wanted to talk about, I think the original thing was on Twitter, and I was saying, oh, all that Bukowski that I consumed as a young woman, like, hungrily being a rebel, like, I'm learning about the dirty world. And then I realized years later that I was basically just eating misogyny and swallowing it and transforming it into something else. But it was definitely a journey from that something to what I write now, which tends to be certainly feminist and also I think very feminine, like, and that's how this began.
Yeah, and I mean, I was saying, well, I read, and this is on Twitter, so remember, 140 characters each. So I said, well, I read Henry Miller when I was 14, from Plexus, Sexus, Nexus, Prophet of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer, all of them. And when I realized that the only women in there were like appendages. I mean, there were no actually women characters in there. But I ate it up, and I appreciated, for whatever the heck it was, sex. I was obsessed with sex, all right? I didn't have sex, I knew nothing about it practically, but reading about it, I was there. And I knew much more about all my fellow mid-teens because I read about it, even though I knew nothing.
Well, that's how you find out.
Right.
It's like, wait.
So I said, that's wrong. And they said this happened. I was like, no, it doesn't. It's like, but anyway, so I was busy reading stuff like that, and an interesting jump. There are other things I read at that point, but early, when I actually decided I was a feminist in my early 20s, or during college, and I think when I was 18, 19, 20, I started reading the so-called proto-feminist novels like The Woman's Room and Kinflick, which when I first started reading it aloud, it was hilarious. And then The Woman's Room gets darker and darker and really ugly, and I think kind of misogynist, actually. And I ended up loathing it. So, and Kinflick was also, there's always women as victims, even by these supposedly feminist writers. So that kind of moved from, reading these male writers and reading female writers, and I still got the same message that I don't like this stuff. I mean, these people are not doing how I want to live. Anyway, that's where this came from, and as it's a discussion, whoever wants to jump in next.
I would like to actually, you want to go ahead and kill it?
No, okay, go ahead.
And I just came from Kathy Klatch, where Honorable Daughter and I were holding forth, and someone wanted to know what was appropriate for her 11-year-old daughter to read. And one of us, not me, had restrictions about that. And I said simply that when I was little, no one cared, no one noticed that you were reading. You read whatever was in the house where you happened to be at the time. Since we moved a lot, okay, native son when I was like 8, and I did go back, and my aunts had a book called Scarlet Sister Mary, where she cooped out babies in the cornfield and Grand Hotel, and I was like, if you don't understand it, it might roll right over you, but it won't hurt you. So that's all I'm going to say.
Well, actually, the group did hurt me, but we can talk about that later.
Oh, well, I wasn't thinking about gender. It is absolutely true that, like, yeah,
There's
because
another
it was
seat
also
here, there are a couple of
comics.
seats here if you want to.
It was also comics. I want to be Robin to Batman, or maybe I'd like to be Batman because there was no female antagonist that I could identify with. No, that was like, no,
okay.
no, it's not that it was later. It was like, yeah, but she was.
She was a girl.
She was a girl. Yeah, there.
So I wanted to ask you about conflicts. I'm sure I read this book. Is this the book that includes a scene where a woman on a motorcycle gets her head cut off?
That's all
by
I
a
remember
wire?
of it. Yes, I was going to say, and as soon as you started to say that, that's the only thing I remember from it.
It's shocking that horror is your
feminist novel, and all I remember is she's driving on her motorcycle and she's a bad
And there's
girl.
a wire.
There's a wire.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's like, this is a feminist novel. Like,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you, because I just said the title and I thought,
Lisa Althor made her die a 1,000 deaths. But anyway, I'm sure she wrote many better books after that.
Well, and I think it's important, what you were saying before about what, we were reading these books, what were we thinking? Well, we weren't. We were reading anything. We were reading anything. And I think for myself, one reason I read so many of, I think many of the male, predominantly male writers that many people here read, and people here, the Beats and Lawrence Durrell and Miller, is they were having lives that I perceived as being successful lives, whereas the women writers who I read and admired their work, and Sylvia Plath, Dorothy Parker, Jen Rees, they were wonderful writers, but as somebody who wanted to be a writer and was looking for a model of a writer, they were suicides, they were depressives, they were alcoholics, and
Their lives had turned to
And
crime.
luckily, I didn't read them till I was older.
and the male writers who were also, alcoholics or depressives, everything is, but that was not necessarily the lesson that I was taking away, and that was not necessarily the lesson that was being perpetrated in the media. When you wouldn't read reviews about that. You wouldn't read
You
essays.
read about their amazing work.
Now you read that. Now we have, our history is opened up to do that. So when I was looking for somebody to model my life after, I thought, well, Dorothy Parker, she was great. She, fun. She was at the Algonquin Round Table. She was funny and all that was great. But she was an alcoholic. She had this long decline. I thought, I don't know that I want to do that. Somebody like Anais Nin was one of the, or Isadora Duncan, who was her, kind of goes along with the motorcycle. But Anais Nin, who I now just, years ago found just completely unreadable. It was hard for me to recall what it was that just intoxicated me about her work as a teenager, but I think it was that she was a woman, she was a writer, she was really out and open about being a writer, and she was having a great time, and she was like screwing people, she was having affairs with women, and it was only much later, reading after her death, the revelations about her diaries and seducing her own father, and it was like, she had edited her own diaries very carefully, and then when you go back and reread them, you're like, she was whitewashing her own history as well. So it was very, I think younger people, Julia, might have a different experience than we do.
This is really interesting that you would say that. So in my house, I was allowed to read anything I wanted to. My mother was very concerned about what I might watch. So things like Silence of the Lambs came out when I was 11 or 12, and I remember all the adults being super excited about how great psychological horror it was, and I really wanted to see it, and she was like, no way, that's horrible. And Pretty Woman was another one that everybody loved, and nope, you can't see that. But I could read the book, so I read Silence of the Lambs, and worse than the movie, by the way, which I saw later. But I also, I was trying to find a map for my own identity and my own sexuality and things like that. And I was a very confused young woman at the time where, like, I'm bisexual, but at the time I was, like, pretty sure that was a terrible idea and no one should ever do that. So I read The Sensuous Woman by Jay.
By Jay.
I read this when I was 13. It is terrible. It's horrible. It's like, basically, you should scrub all the floors before your husband gets home, and then he's going to have to spend all day thinking about ball bearings, so don't talk to him about work. Just be ready to have sex. And you probably won't enjoy it, but you can enjoy it if you just think about how much it's nice to have a penis inside you. And the whole book is like that, and you think I'm, like, sugarcoating it, or, like, laying it bare, but I'm not. It's actually, like, in those words. It's a whole book length of that. So I read that, and at the same time, I was reading things like The Children's Hour by Lillian Hellman, which is a play involving women who are lesbians, but it's like the worst thing in the world, and in the end, like, it's all tragedy and sadness. So I was like, pretty sure that's out, and I'd better work on, like, scrubbing floors before my husband gets home.
I mean, I just read everything. My parents let me read anything in the house. Most of it was pretty innocuous, in this sense, of that kind of this. Although I did make me want, I always loved fairy tales. But I mean, back to the obsession. I mean, I read Frigidity in Women at 18 because it seemed interesting, and it was boring. And I read The Marquis de Sade, and it was fucking boring. I was in the bedroom, and maybe one of the most boring sex books you have ever read in your life, except for 120 Days of Sodom. I got through it for 3 days, but it was so boring. Yeah. And I just, like, it was curious, and then I jumped. But I was mostly reading men, I realized.
But trying to learn about women's lives by reading
Well, I wasn't, but I wasn't trying. I wasn't trying to do anything. I was just a voracious reader. I mean, I didn't have, as a 12 to 17-year-old until I went to college, I had no agenda when I was reading. I didn't know what I was doing. I just loved reading stuff, and I was trying to read what now we would say is transgressive because it was forbidden, and my parents would get. Now, I would read my father's softcore porn when my parents and his Playboys would look at them when he wasn't around.
See, now you're like,
and I think
reading
I
my
got
list
caught
here.
once.
I know, me too, I have one too.
Yeah, and that's when I realized, I've said this before, but some of you may not have heard this. This is how I learned about sex, and even a little bit. But even my dad's softcore porn, it's like I realized these people are having sex all the time. How do they make a living? Somehow this doesn't make sense. And I couldn't ask my parents, you know.
Well, I was in the same position as a lot of us. I think that my parents let me read whatever I want, with the exception of one book, which I will get to in a second. But my mother was a grammar school librarian. She was actually a librarian at my school when I was growing up. So I had this fantastic experience from a young age of spending summers with her as she was cataloging the new books for up through 8th grade reading. And she was just like, here, honey, here's a big stack of books. You know, mommy needs to do a boatload of work now, so go read things. So I read all the things at a variety of levels, and I was always taking books out of the library. We had a system in our school with our little library cards that if a book was overdue, the teacher would read out the list of overdue books and the library card number associated with it. And one day I didn't do my calendar math very effectively, and a book that was overdue came up, and my teacher, who was probably in her 50s at that point, went bright red as she read out my library card number, which everybody knew because we were all sequential by alphabet. And it's like, what a boy wants to know about sex. and everybody looked at me, and I think I was in 5th grade. But I was really curious. I was like, well, I know there are things I want to know about sex. What do boys want to know? And so, but I remember the feeling, I wasn't ashamed. I was embarrassed because I felt like something private had just been put out in a place for judgment and for, I don't know, and so when you say transgressive, that's the word. All the things that I looked for when I was little, I realized that I was looking for things that felt transgressive to me, to just push back and see what was going on. So I found all my dad's Playboy magazines. They might have been my mom's too, I'm not sure, I don't think so. And I was also a great big fan of all kinds of direct, like Dark Shadows on TV. Which was my first appointment television, was Dark Shadows, because of the drama and the feels and the kind of weird, creepy TV, 1960s TV sexuality and that kind of thing.
I'm from Idaho, I'm from rural Idaho, and there was nothing, like in the middle of nowhere with nothing. And but my father was a voracious reader of everything, so he had tons and tons of stuff, mostly about like sled dog breeding, and also all kinds of things that were out of my reading league and had no experience. But at one point when I was 11, we're going to say, because we looked up the dates on how this happened in the restaurant just a minute ago. So first I read Looking for Mr. Goodbar, which was like, I thought might be about a candy bar. And it was about a candy bar. A very bad candy bar. Like a really, really fucking bad candy bar. And the whole book you're like, yes, she's doing... Oh no, she's killed. Okay, the end of that book is a bummer. So that happened. I read that. And at the same time, I found my dad's Playboys in his office, which were like he had his stack. And I found a Playboy that had Susan Sarandon in it.
Ooh.
It had our kind of woman, Susan Sarandon, and I was like, smart and sexy. And I'm like 11 and thinking, yes. But I didn't have a good context for how to become that. So I got to the pictures of her, and she's very hot, and she's like, we were looking this up, trying to find the actual picture, because she didn't do a centerfold. In my memory, it's a centerfold. But, one boob is out, and she maybe is, like, kind of reclining. I remember her as wearing glasses. And I thought, how do I become her? How does this work? And so I started to eat the centerfold. I pulled the edge, I tore a little bit of the edge and rolled it up and ate it.
Wow.
And over a little while, I ate all of Susan Sarandon. I consumed the entirety of her.
That's it, the panel's over.
I am going to become Susan Sarandon.
Well, it worked.
We only know that, right? But then, like later, I think both of those two things combined into wanting to write a sort of monstrous women. I got really interested in writing fantastical monstrous women. And obviously, I was a monstrous woman. I ate Susan Sarandon. But like also the monstrosity of what happens in Mr. Goodbar, like the thing that happens to her, she's totally punished for being a sexual being. And I wanted her to, at the end of that book, I wanted her to go, and just like kill everyone. Like everyone deserved to go but her, but it was all just so bad and distressing. So yeah, definitely eating Susan Sarandon and reading that terrible book led me to feminist, fantastical stuff, I think. Like it's pretty direct.
What was going through your head, like eating that picture would make you be did you really think it would work that way?
I wanted her to belong only to me, and that was a way to do it. Like, to eat her was a way to make her mine. And also she was clearly, I thought, looking at the Playboy, like now I think I would look at it and be like, questionable. But like then I thought she's being respected for being smart. Like it says smart here. And I was like, and everyone is saying, also beautiful and smart, and all of it is at once. And I thought that eating her would just, like, you are what you eat. I thought, and I wanted to be a grown-ass woman so badly when I was 11, you know? Like 11 is a terrible time where you think you're going to be a girl forever and never have any power. And then you're a woman, and for a while, you know, that can happen too.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and I knew that people, my friend in high school's parents' sex book, the Reader's Digest, which described a kid's penis, I was like, you know, I was reading in part to find out what that was and what you did with it. At that age and, you know, later, but the other thing that was going on was I was at the same time reading the Oz books, and the central figures were all girls.
Yeah.
And they could do, as it turned out, almost anything. and that was a very big thing.
Including switching their gender.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whatever worked. You know, that you had, I never had this like sense of being constrained. But the other weird thing about my education that made me think you could do anything you wanted was because I was educated by nuns. They had nun housekeepers, they had nun house cleaners, their minds were free, and they never said, you can't both get married, have kids, and have a career. They never said that. So I grew up thinking I could do anything I wanted.
See, I grew up assuming I would go to college, get married, and have kids.
Oh, not me.
Until I was in college in around 1970. I took an independent degree in female sexuality, and it was just one-on-one with me and a male teacher. No, and we. And he assigned me, you know, all the Simone de Beauvoir, all the feminist works, Robin, Morgan, Sisterhood is Powerful. He basically got me, and the ironic thing is years later he did come on to me after I graduated, but that was weird. But during the independent study, it was totally, you know, and that taught me feminism, and suddenly I realized, wait a minute, I don't have to have children. And I never looked back. I didn't realize, but that's how I was brought up, that it was an assumption.
I went to college and people thought all you did was grow up and get married and have children. I was like, that can't be all there is, because there's no way I'm just going to only do that. So I knew from the time that I was in high school, college, that I was going to do what I was going to do, and nothing was going to get in the way. And I ended up married for 100 years and had 3 kids.
I think there was a breaking point, and almost a secret history in the late 60s and the 1970s, which was when I came of age. Because I think everyone here, I'm hearing very similar narratives of, you know, Playboy. It was, our literature and culture was curated for us, not in the way that we use the word now, but there were people, the imagery that we had, the images we had access to sexually and culturally and in literature and arts was received in a very particular way, and we received it was a very particular worldview. But in the 70s, when you started getting even things like Looking for Mr. Goodbar, Memoirs of an Ex-Prom Queen, does anyone remember that? By Alan Schiller? Yeah, Fear of Flying. All of a sudden, you know, and there was a magazine, because I would look at, never in my household, I did find The Sensuous Woman and the Happy Hooker. So I like hidden, you know, in my mother's, in a drawer with my mother's birth control pill. But nothing like We or Penthouse. I would read those at the places where I babysit. And I'd read them like obsessively. And so, you know, and that was the image
Anywhere you could find out.
that was what, you know, that was the sort of image of sex that was imprinted on me, until there was a magazine that came out in the 70s called Viva. Does anyone remember that?
Yeah,
Viva.
created by Gucci.
But it was for, you know, it was ostensibly for women, and it had these sexy, full frontal centerfold photos of men. But they were pretty hot. And I can remember having those and like hiding them under my
I would have
mattress.
been really interested if they had it.
Well, and so it didn't last very long. It lasted maybe a year, 18 months.
And then it became Omni.
But then, you know,
That was the next thing after Omni was after Fever.
oh my God.
Well, but then, there you have the whole sex science fiction.
That's how. And there's another.
No, I was just going to say Angela Carter. You know,
Yes.
Then she, you know, and that really was sex and fantasy and science fiction. When she started getting published in this country and being able to pick up on her.
I think she's the bridge. Like, she's, for me, when I found her, I was like, oh, thank God, I don't have to read.
Exactly.
And
that's what
bad
I
things
felt.
happen, and blood happens, and terror happens, and yet it's all written with this, like, massive empathy towards the female characters. It's Lizzie Borden's story.
That was the first book the first author who I found, and I felt like, oh, well, this is what I wanted to do. I didn't know you could do this. I didn't know you could be a woman to do this. And then when Patti Smith appeared in 1974, 75, and here was a woman who was an artist and a poet and a writer, a rock critic, and then, you know, later a performer, and she wasn't taking any shit from anyone. So these are the good influences, but I think that they were, you know, at that time, they were sort of the forward guard. Now I think I mean, are there what are the bad influences?
So like, I just want to jump off of that because we talked a lot about how we were all pushing for transgressive things. I mean, when I read The Sensuous Woman, I was looking for that thing, and what I got was terrible. But that led me, also music was really important to me. So the good influences that kind of led me out of that showed me that something else was possible would be Bette Midler, who was just like, I'm a super weird person that doesn't fit into any boxes, and I don't care. And then Melissa Etheridge, who had a song that when I was a teenager was like a lifeline, who's like, oh, it's actually okay if you like people who are the same gender as you. Maybe it's not the end of the world. And then Liz Phair, who I think like, I was just the right age when she started to be big, so that it was this woman who was just brazenly like, I'm willing to be whatever kind of owning my sexuality that I want to be, and you're all gonna deal with that. And that led me into finding women writers, because at the same time, I was reading things like, I thought Ezra Pound was the most awesome poet ever. And later I was like, oh, you know, he wasn't so hot on how he treated women at all. But finding these musicians kind of led me into other places, like to Dorothy Parker, to Flannery O'Connor, to seeing what kinds of things you could do that were not following that bad narrative.
I'm thinking about this, and most of you came along post Betty Friedan, and I think Betty Friedan is when people started thinking about this stuff, but I was very lucky because I didn't have to think about it. And for me, there was no glass ceiling, there were no glass walls, there was whatever I wanted to do. And
But I think that's
your
unusual
generation,
for your generation, that's unusual.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
I was like, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, I didn't know that.
Well, I remember the different perception we had. We talked about this, reading Lolita as a young teenager. And I read it probably because I heard it was a dirty book or something, I don't know. And then my perception when I read it 20 years or 30 years later, and how depressing I found it. And
Oh,
we
yes,
talked about
absolutely.
that. I mean, it's a devastating, depressing horror story about this guy who destroys this young girl. But when I first read it, I didn't see it. I don't know how I saw it, but I found it interesting.
I read it
didn't see
for the young girl. I read it because I thought it was going to be a book about a girl like me. I read it when I was about 13, and I was like, it's called Lolita.
Yeah.
It should be
About a girl.
about a girl, and instead it's like,
About this guy's obsession.
but I had this really interesting experience recently, like speaking, like in this moment, teaching teenage girls who told me, like they're all writers, they were amazing, they're 18, they were a really diverse group of teenage girls and really talented. And I said, what's your favorite book? And they said, Lolita. Wow. And I was like,
Whoa, wait, why? Did they say why?
because they were like, it's so stylized and the style is so amazing. And I was like, but what is it about? And they're like, it's about a girl. And I'm like, okay, you don't have the context yet. Like when you're that young, I think you're hungry for anything to be about a girl.
And my daughter had that. I've had that experience seeing my daughter do this, because reading the book when I was very young and loving it and rereading it, and then reading it as I got older, as Ellen was saying when we talked about it, it is so depressing. And then reading it as a parent of young children and of a young daughter. And then my daughter, I don't think I gave it to her. She might have just found it in the house.
How old was she?
She was about young. She was maybe 14, 15, and she read, and she loves Lolita. It's like her favorite book. She's 25 now. She's read it, 2 or 3 or 4 times.
What did she get out of it?
I think probably, I'll ask her. I think probably some of it is the sort of transgressive element, but I think also the fact that that's a great book. I mean, that's not, unlike a lot of the other books that we were talking about, which are bad, are not good books. That actually is a great book, but it's not, nobody's looking for Humbert as a role model. I would hope.
Well, Lolita isn't necessarily.
Well, and also how many, I guess I'm trying to think back to what I found in it. I was a little bit older. I was, maybe 15 or 16. How many books when you're reading it at that age, when I was reading it at that age, the character of Lolita is in a very sick way, is valorized by Humbert. She is he loves her. I mean, she is the center of his world. So I think reading that, on the one hand, you see, because he's doing the thing that pedophiles do, it's like, oh, they have all the power over me. I'm powerless. I have no power. And to read that in reading it, it's basically, you know, still almost a child, I think I absorbed that, like, oh, she, you know, she is the one, she has the power. And it wasn't until I was older and reading it, and I was like, no, of course she never had any power.
Probably when you were
She's
the
10 years old, she's a 12-year-old.
She's 12.
You know? And
Yeah.
reading it, you know, 18, 19, 20, you're thinking, oh no, this is, you know, she doesn't have any power.
But it takes a while to come around to that.
Yeah, a lot of people saw the movie first, and when she's much older in the movie,
Right.
it makes a difference.
And I think it makes a difference too what perspective you're reading from as a young person. Because I came from a perspective of, I've always been interested in issues of power and responsibility and agency, just because of my circumstances when I was growing up. Those things were a big part of my world. And so part of what I was reading for was, I was reading for sex because
we always are.
And I was reading to because I'm also bisexual, and I obviously had no notion about that at the time, but I was reading all these things to try to figure out what other people knew about sex and what they wanted to do. But the transgressive aspects for me were often not just about sex, but they were about people getting out of their box, people transgressing against the things that were around them, or making choices that were non-standard in their context. And I was very happy to read anything like that. So I read every book I could get my hands on basically about children in danger. I wasn't in danger in my childhood, but I wanted to read those books because I wanted to find out how kids got out of things. And then when I started finding the occasional books, they were all written by men, but they were girls in them. So I read David R. Palmer's Emergence, and I read Rite of Passage by Alexei Panshin. I don't know if anybody remembers this, which I tore my copy to shreds pretty much, reading and rereading and rereading, because those were the first things I found where the stories were actually about the girls, and the girls were moving through their stories. And that made me, being attuned to notions of power and class and responsibility, made me discard a lot of things in my early reading that a lot of other people read. And so in a particularly weird way, I'm not well read at all, because I would put things down as soon as they triggered those buttons for me and not read them.
It's an interesting thought that what you were just saying made me think about how early reading about sexuality, and we're all hunting the same thing, like is also an attempt to read about recategorization for girls, I think. It's about like, how can I resituate the power structure? Lolita is the same thing. It's this idea that you have the power, she has the power. And I remember reading The Lover, the Marguerite Duras. It's called the North China Lover. Is that what the original is called? Yeah. And yes, and she's a young girl, and she has this older lover. And it's written by a woman who has lots of ideas. But I remember reading that and thinking, well, this is a way to change the class structure, to change the hierarchical structure of the universe. And it turns out that sex is, of course, not the only way to do that, but when you are a young girl, you're so sexualized, the universe sexualizes you, and you are also very interested in sex, like that first interest, but no clue really what it is. I think it's this vision that you're going to be able to, that there must be some way to move from where you are to a new place where you have a lot more power. And reading, and all of these like really sexualized young girls in that early reading represent a certain kind of power. They represent power over the men who are in charge, which is so tempting. Like the other book that my students told me it was their other favorite book, it was The Virgin Suicides.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again.
Yeah. I remember reading, I remember the Harrod Experiment.
Oh, I remember
I
that.
love that. Oh, it was basically a thinly veiled Harvard and Radcliffe experiment of boys and girls living together. It was, at the time when it was written, which must have been in the mid-60s, I'm guessing, it was like, wow, this is like revolutionary. And it was very sexy. Of course, they always had sex, which was fun. But it was just one of these books like Harrison High, which I did not read. It was even before my time, which was still like sex scenes, and apparently that you had to look up on certain pages. But the Harrod Experiment was one that kind of was open sexually. And then I read The Group by Mary McCarthy, and that just fucked me up. It totally, and it's so,
You said it ruined your life.
It did, well, it took a really long time. It scared the shit out of me. Okay, I must have read it in my mid-teens. I don't know why I picked it up, but I was trying to read women writers, I think. And I think for years I was afraid of sex. And I went to therapy, not for that, but just, other reasons, like late 70s. And I went for 3 years. And I guess somehow the group came up. I had a female therapist, a Jungian, and she said, well, what bothered you about it? I said, I don't know. I said, well, why don't you reread it? I said, oh, okay. And I reread it, and it's basically these several women who graduate from I forget where, some Ivy League college, or women's college, and they all have horrible, fucked up lives. One of them gets abandoned with a diaphragm under the park dotty. I remember their names. One of them dies in childbirth or something. One is like, these are all these promising young women who graduated from college. And one's a lesbian. Yeah, well, that's the one who was the leader of them is a lesbian and with this,
the smartest, the prettiest.
So basically I said, oh, no wonder. It's like everything is depressed about these women. It's the most depressive novel that you can read if you're a young woman trying to find out what's going to happen to you in the world when you graduate college and what your life would be.
But there was, I'm sorry.
No,
There was a corrective to that.
There was.
Which is, there was a panel on it yesterday, which was in 1975 in January, so early in the year, when Chip Delaney's Dahlgren came out, and there was a very transgressive book that was actually about sex and about every kind of sex you can imagine, and it was a dystopian, utopian novel, and that took things like the Harrod experiment and
But I didn't read that till I was 20. That was way too late. But I was already ruined.
You were already
So I'd like to go back to something that Ellen said earlier. You were asking about examples of things that are maybe bad influences today. And I'm thinking about reading Lolita earlier and then 20 years later and whoa, it's a completely different book and horrifying. For me, a book like that was Jane Eyre. When I read it first, I was 15, and I thought it was the most romantic story ever. And then I read it like 10 years later, and I was like, whoa, this is really fucked up. Because, basically, there's this guy who has all this power, and he's going to try to marry her even though he's already married, and he's got his other wife locked up in the attic. Sorry, spoilers for Jane Eyre, but it is really and, he does not treat her well, and then, she goes off, and her option is, either marry your cousin and become a missionary, or ... So this is a terrifying experience, and it was something that is a horrifying example of something that you should take as a role model if you're a young woman, but at the time, I was like, this would be the best thing ever if I could marry my horrible boss. And I think today, two of the things that are enormously popular that young women are probably reading are Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey. And I still defend everyone's right to like those because I think that people are able to eventually make their own decisions about what's actually good and bad, and people like all kinds of problematic things for many different reasons. But both of those feature very controlling, very abusive male heroes who are basically coming in and taking control of a young woman's life. And I feel like that would be the kind of thing, if you have this panel in 10 years, there are probably a lot of women who would be like, I read Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey.
Liz wrote a whole Washington Post.
I wrote something in the Washington Post. I had not read the Twilight books. I was aware of them, and I'd read a lot about them, and I was asked by the Washington Post to review the last one in the series, and it was an embargoed book, so which means you don't, as a reviewer, you don't get the book until midnight of the day it's released. So you have to speed read it and then write the review. So, and I've done this before. I did this with the last Harry Potter book. So I knew what I was in for. But with the Harry Potter books I've been reading, the Twilight sequence I was not. So I had to binge and basically read the previous books and then read the third book. And I was appalled. And I don't, for anybody who's a fan of that or who has, kids or friends who are fans, and I think people can and should be whatever they want. I would never tell. I gave the books, I gave the copies to kids I knew who were fans. I was like, here's the book. But the fact that people, that librarians and some book reviewers and people were talking about these as being good books for girls to read. I thought that was, and I hadn't read them, so I didn't know, but I read a lot about them, and I did not agree with that, because I thought they were creepy, and the Bella is grossly infantilized, and she's, the man she's involved, the boy she's involved with is actually a man in a boy's body, and the number of times throughout those books that he's carrying her like a child, piggybacking, it was I found it a very, very disturbing experience to read these and to think, and I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know, but to think that this was being presented as everybody was, people were buying these books to give to their daughters and their nieces and children, saying this is a great book for a girl to read.
I think people have the same mythology of everybody mistook those books as being about the girl.
Yeah,
And those books were not about the girl.
and I did find that very disturbing. And then in the final book, where she's pregnant and the child inside her is like eating her, destroying her, but it's still okay because that was the other thing, that sex is something that has to be withheld until marriage. And then once you're married, it's okay to have sex, and that's, and if you do it before, then you'll be punished for it. And then even when you do it afterwards and you're pregnant, you're punished for it then too. I mean, I found it a really unsettling message, and I thought it did not say very good things about our literary culture, that this was just being sort of, that people were drinking the Kool-Aid without thinking at all about it, that it was really,
That analyzing its politics or yeah.
And that's also a thing that played out in a lot of the films that I saw when I was a kid, and that you can still see now. So these are what in our house we call the fuck and die movies. Sex equals death. Friday the 13th, right? You go out to summer camp, you're a teenager, you're gonna have sex, and next thing you know, bang, that's your, stake through your throat or whatever. And to me, the thing that really, among many other things that bothered me so much about the Twilight series, is this notion that, that partly sex is being withheld by Mr. Power Guy because, it might hurt her and he would kill her and etc. And so basically, she has to die in order to, in order to enter into this marriage and this relationship and to have love. She has to, like, her actual self has to die.
Well, and I think one of the things with that is the idea that when you lose your virginity, your virgin self is now dead, and that is something that the society is pressing on girls. Like, once it's gone forever, and you are now a dirty, tainted person who is not the innocent, pure person and can never be that again.
And see, I didn't think, maybe I'm just completely out of step with modern culture, but I didn't think that was a feature of
So my mom
culture.
was an elementary school teacher in a very conservative rural area, and all of the other teachers at her elementary school kept trying to press her to read Twilight because they all thought it was very romantic, and they all had that idea. And I think that's something you see a lot when you're in a place where there is a heavy, like, conservative Christian population. There are things like purity dances where dads and teenage daughters get dressed up and go to the dance, and then he gives her a ring that she promises she will not have sex until she's married.
We're gonna take some questions now.
So I was wondering if you guys could speak to your experience as a reader, which doesn't necessarily have to be a particular work, in recognizing the internalized misogyny in you. Because I grew up in like a really progressive town with a great school librarian who was like all girl power, like definitely trying to steer me in a better direction. And yet, when I started to get interested in speculative literature, it was like these male authors are making interesting, magical, realist like literature, and these female authors are just woo-woo, and that's bad. And like women doing fantasy and women doing sci-fi is kind of like, for some reason I learned that somewhere along the line, and I didn't necessarily learn it from the male authors saying bad things. It was like, I curated for myself to read them at the expense of women when I was very young. And it wasn't until I read like Golden Compass, where I was like, oh, a girl can do things, and a man can even write a girl who does things, and she has like internalized misogyny in the first book, and she like grows out of it. And like that whole journey was such a mirror for me when I was like a older teenager. So I just wanted to sort of hear what you guys sort of thought about, like where in your reading experience, as especially speculative and magical realist, like, oh shit, like I'm like what part of this is like me now? Like even if you did get it from the outside culture, like that kind of unpacking that toxic stuff in yourself.
So I read How to Suppress Women's Writing by Joanna Russ.
Woo!
Yeah. That was a big eye-opener. And I think like in a lot of editions of the book, the cover of it is just a list of ways in which people demean women's writing. And even if you just look at that cover, it will already make you start questioning everything you think about yourself.
Angela Carter's The Passion of New Eve was a book that made me really think about a lot of internalized misogyny and you know, homophobia, a lot of things. I mean, I'm bisexual, so I'm not, you know, I was not conscious of how much I've taken from culture at large. But that was a book that had a big impact on me. And it's, you know, it's a man named Evelyn who comes to the he's British, he comes to the United States, and he's kidnapped by sort of Mansonite terrorists, and he's forced to undergo a sex change operation, and he becomes a woman, and he's taken on this very surreal, it's a sort of a post-apocalyptic novel across the United States where he visits these sort of communes and things and ends up having this encounter with this kind of strange, numinous movie star who has also an ambiguous sexuality. But that was a great book. It kind of up there with How to Suppress Women's Writing, sort of exploding my notions of things.
What was it about again?
It's called The Passion of New Eve. When the man his name is Evelyn, and then when they give him the sex change operation, he becomes Eve. And I wouldn't say that I mean, it probably is dated. I read it not too many years ago, but it's dated in the sense that it's very much of its time. It was a book that was really, there's a lot of references to the counterculture and the sexual revolution and stuff in the 60s and 70s, but it's written by Angela Carter, so it's really, it's a beautiful book.
I've been rereading Angela Carter's Shaking a Leg, which is a collection of her, basically all of her nonfiction, which I think you guys should just pick it up again. It's amazing. It's so much, and a lot of it is dated, but it's dated with this really progressive mind inside of it. But for me, it was Orlando. It was Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I was like, and it's similar actually. I was like, okay, this is written by someone I know. She's known to be a genius, known. And then getting into it, and just she's great. Like she's one of those few women writers who's always categorized as a great genius writer. And that book is so transgressive, and the way that it's written is insane. It's wonderfully insane. And I thought, oh my God. All of my ideas about what I can write stylistically as a woman, what I can write like structurally, because I had ideas that I just had to tell a story that made sense, because otherwise men would never listen to it. You know, so it needed to make sense and not be transgressive. I couldn't be that gay, you know, I couldn't do that. So then I read Orlando and went, oh, right, well, fuck that shit.
Experiment, yeah. Women are just weird.
Yeah, and you're not doing it right if you're experimenting as a woman writer in the original.
Another question?
I wondered if you could talk about your experiences and perhaps attitudes towards the romance genre and the women who write romance.
I can. I read a lot. I went through a period of reading a lot of Harlequin romance and silhouette romance when I was in my 20s, and felt really conflicted about reading them. I felt like I was breaking all the rules now because I was a scare quotes. I was a trashy reader. I was anti-feminist. I was falling for the models and etc. But I stopped reading them because after a while I figured out that the formula always involved that at the end, no matter how it's presented, at the end, the guy wins, that there really is some kind of battle going on, and that the man wins in a particular way, and that a woman, the women in these books coming to understand what they really want has to do with them understanding that what they really want is whatever the guy said. That he has basically come in and shown them where the better world is, and they just have to go through the fires of hell to figure that out for themselves, which is not untrue in life, right? I mean, that's a big part of how we get to be ourselves, is by seeing something that we want or having somebody show us something that we could be. But I figured out that I just didn't want to be the snarky businesswoman or the plucky shop girl or the au pair or whatever. I'm sorry, this is a long answer to your question. I also really admire the shit out of those women who write all those books, because they work really hard. They tell, within the constraints of the formula, they tell a lot of really original stories. And these are women who are, they're the most high, some of the most highly paid authors in the field. They write 3 books a year. They have fans who love them. And they offer, to me, they offer something that's different from what Twilight offers. To me, Twilight offers girls a notion of being smothered. And I think that the modern romance genre is looking for ways to offer women opportunities for considering other lives. I don't know if that's true, but that's how I perceive it.
I unabashedly love romance. I have been reading it for like as long as I can remember, because my mom always had romance novels around the house. And I definitely had sort of a period of realizing that the standard narrative, especially of romance novels that were published in the 80s, was toxic. I have seen a lot of changes in recent years, and you have a lot of authors out there like Courtney Milan who are really pushing the boundaries of that, and making stories that really are about the women and not about the men winning the women, and examining different roles for them. And I think that there are also a lot of things going on in romance fandom with blogs like Smart Bitches Trashy Books, with people making a lot of really interesting and entertaining lit crit about romance and taking it seriously as a genre, because if we don't take it seriously as a genre, we can't hope to make it better.
A friend
you mentioned Alexei Panshin's Rite of Passage.
Yes.
Panshin claimed that was the second volume of his Heinlein critique, and makes me wonder, I would imagine that some of you at least would have read the Heinlein Juveniles. Would you consider that, in the context of what you've been talking about today, a good influence or a bad influence?
I read all of them. I read all of Heinlein, and I loved it, and it got me through a lot of difficult times, because I would reread and I had tattered books. And I'm terrified to read them again, and I can't do it, because I'm afraid of what I find.
Oh, we are done.
We're done,
We're
unfortunately.
done.
Farah Mendelssohn has been rereading
Yes.
all the Heinleins, and you can follow her on Facebook. I haven't looked at everything, but she's doing analysis, reading about them, and commenting on how good and bad they are.
Thank you all very much.